Hawila Kaleohano stood in his field on the island of Niihau and watched a Japanese Zero fighter drop out of the sky. The plane came in low and fast, trailing smoke from underneath the right wing where fuel leaked from punctured tanks. The landing gear was either shot away or retracted. Either way, the pilot was putting down hard. Kaleohano had plowed deep furrows across this field deliberately to prevent exactly this kind of landing. The island's owner, Aylmer Robinson, had ordered it done months ago when tensions with Japan started heating up. The Zero hit the first furrow and bounced violently. The nose dropped, the tail lifted. For a moment, it looked like the plane would cartwheel, but the pilot somehow held it together. The Zero slammed down again, skipped forward, hit another furrow, and nosed into the dirt 70 yards from Kaleohano's house. The propeller bent, the engine shrieked and died. Dust settled. It was just after noon on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Kaleohano was 29 years old, a ranch hand who could read and write, rare on an island where most people spoke only Hawaiian. He'd been reading the newspapers from Kauai for months. He knew the United States and Japan were on the brink of war. He ran toward the crashed plane and climbed onto the wing. The pilot was slumped in the cockpit, unconscious or dazed. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. He was young, maybe 22 or 23. He wore a flight suit with Japanese insignia. Kaleohano didn't know that Pearl Harbor was burning. He didn't know that 1,800 Americans had died that morning while this pilot and his squadron mates dropped bombs on Battleship Row, but he recognized the plane as Japanese, and he knew enough to be careful. He reached into the cockpit and pulled an 8mm Nambu pistol from the pilot's holster. Then he grabbed the pilot's documents, maps, charts, papers covered in Japanese writing. The pilot started to regain consciousness. His eyes opened. He looked at Kaleohano with confusion and growing alarm. Other islanders arrived. They helped the pilot out of the cockpit. He was unsteady on his feet. Someone brought water. The pilot drank. He tried to communicate, but he spoke almost no English, and the Hawaiians spoke no Japanese. Someone suggested fetching Yoshio Harada. Harada and his wife Irene lived on the island. Both spoke Japanese fluently. They could translate. Kaleohano held on to the pistol and the papers. Something told him not to give them back. Not yet. The pilot seemed friendly enough, even grateful for the help, but Kaleohano trusted his instincts. That evening, the island would throw a luau to welcome their unexpected guest. The pilot would play guitar and sing Japanese songs. The Hawaiians would offer him the best hospitality their isolated island could provide. By nightfall, a battery-powered radio would crackle to life with news from Honolulu. The news would change everything. Hospitality would transform into suspicion, guest would become prisoner, and 6 days later, this small island with no electricity, no phones, and no connection to the outside world would become the site of a desperate struggle that would influence the fate of over 100,000 Japanese Americans across the United States. 136 people lived on Niihau. Most of them spoke only Hawaiian. None of them knew that the war had just arrived on their doorstep. And the young pilot standing in Hawila Kaleohano's field, Airman First Class Shigenori Nishikaichi, had no intention of becoming anyone's prisoner. How did an isolated Hawaiian island become the scene of a 6-day hostage crisis immediately after Pearl Harbor? Why did 3 residents of Japanese descent help an enemy pilot terrorize their neighbors? And what happened when a 51-year-old Hawaiian rancher decided he'd had enough and charged a man holding a loaded pistol? This is the story of the Niihau Incident, the battle that happened after the battle, the forgotten siege on the Forbidden Island. Niihau sits 17 miles southwest of Kauai, the westernmost inhabited island in the Hawaiian chain. It measures 18 miles long and 6 miles wide. At its widest point, volcanic rock and lava cliffs dominate the eastern shore. The interior is dry scrubland, suitable for ranching, but little else. In 1941, approximately 136 people lived there, almost all of them native Hawaiians, whose first language was Hawaiian. The island had been privately owned since 1864, when King Kamehameha V sold it to Elizabeth Sinclair for $10,000. By 1941, ownership had passed to her descendants, the Robinson family. Aylmer Robinson managed the island from his home on Kauai. He was a Harvard graduate, fluent in Hawaiian, and he ran Niihau without interference from any government authority. Robinson rarely allowed outsiders to visit. The island was kapu, forbidden to anyone except friends or relatives of Niihauans. There were no telephones, no electricity except for a few battery-powered radios, no regular mail service. Robinson made weekly visits by boat, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. That was the island's only reliable contact with modern Hawaii. Most Niihauans worked as ranch hands, raising sheep and cattle. Life moved at a pace that hadn't changed much in generations. The traditional Hawaiian culture remained strong. People spoke Hawaiian at home. They fished, farmed small gardens, and lived simply. The island was isolated not just geographically but culturally, a window into what Hawaii had been before statehood, before tourism, before the 20th century arrived with all its complications. Among the island's residents were three people of Japanese descent. Ishimatsu Shintani was 60 years old, and Issei, a first-generation immigrant from Japan. He'd spent most of his adult life in Hawaii and worked as a beekeeper on Niihau. Yoshio Harada was 38, a Nisei, second generation, born in Hawaii, an American citizen by birth. His wife Irene was also of Japanese descent, and Issei like Shintani. The Haradas spoke both English and Japanese fluently. They lived quietly and were well regarded by their Hawaiian neighbors. In early December 1941, tensions between the United States and Japan had reached the breaking point. The newspapers that arrived weekly on Niihau carried stories about Japanese expansion in China, American oil embargoes, and deteriorating diplomatic relations. Most Niihauans couldn't read English, but those who could, like Hawila Kaleohano, understood that trouble was coming. Nobody expected it to land in their field. At 0600 hours on December 7, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off from 6 aircraft carriers cruising 200 miles north of Oahu. 183 planes, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers headed south toward Pearl Harbor. Airman First Class Shigenori Nishikaichi flew a Mitsubishi Zero fighter from the carrier Hiryu. He was 22 years old, from the coastal town of Hashihama in Ehime Prefecture. This was his first combat mission. He'd been assigned to the second wave of the attack, which would launch an hour and a half after the first wave. The first wave struck at 0755 hours. By the time Nishikaichi's group arrived over Oahu, around 0900 hours, American defenses were fully alert. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. A squadron of Curtiss P-36 Hawk fighters had managed to get airborne from Wheeler Field despite the chaos. They engaged the Japanese fighters in a swirling dogfight. Nishikaichi had been assigned to escort bombers attacking Bellows Field, an American Army airbase on the eastern shore of Oahu. He strafed the field with his 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns. He saw American aircraft destroyed on the ground. He witnessed the battleship Arizona bellowing thick black smoke after a bomb detonated her forward magazine at 0810 hours. He saw other battleships burning, capsizing, settling into the mud of Pearl Harbor, but he also saw that the Americans were fighting back. Anti-aircraft fire from the ships was intense. The P-36 Hawks were aggressive. During the dogfight, Nishikaichi's Zero took at least 6 hits. Most were superficial damage to the wings and fuselage, but one round punctured his fuel tank. At first, the damage seemed manageable. The engine ran smoothly enough. But as the Japanese aircraft regrouped for the flight back to their carriers, Nishikaichi noticed his fuel consumption was excessive. The engine began running rough. He fell behind the other Zeros. By the time he reached the rendezvous point where the strike force was supposed to gather, he was alone. He spotted another Zero approaching, this one trailing heavy smoke. The pilot was Airman Second Class Saburo Ishii. During the morning briefing aboard their carrier, the pilots had been told that any aircraft too damaged to return should attempt emergency landings on Niihau, the westernmost Hawaiian island. A submarine would be waiting offshore to rescue them. Intelligence had assured them that Niihau was uninhabited. Nishikaichi and Ishii circled together briefly. Nishikaichi signaled that they should both head for Niihau. Ishii shook his head. He'd just radioed his carrier, Shokaku, that he intended to return to Oahu and crash dive into some worthwhile target. Nishikaichi watched in horror as Ishii climbed steeply, then dove straight into the ocean. The splash was small. The Zero disappeared. Nishikaichi was alone now, nursing a crippled fighter with fuel pouring from his tank. His carrier Hiryu was already steaming away from Hawaii at maximum speed, headed back toward Japan. The return flight was over 200 miles. He'd never make it. He turned west toward Niihau. 20 minutes later, he passed south of Kauai's green volcanic slopes. Dead ahead, the lava cliffs of Niihau's eastern shore appeared. Nishikaichi circled the island once, looking for a place to land. He quickly discovered that whoever lived on Niihau had prepared for exactly this kind of emergency landing. The fields had been plowed with deep furrows, specifically to prevent aircraft from landing. It was crude, but effective. Nishikaichi had no choice. His fuel was nearly gone. He lined up on the least damaged field he could find and committed to the landing. The Zero hit hard. The nose gear was either shot away or wouldn't deploy. The plane bounced violently through the furrows. The tail lifted, and for a terrible moment, Nishikaichi thought he'd cartwheel, but he held it together. The Zero nosed into the dirt and stopped 70 yards from a small house. Nishikaichi sat in the cockpit, dazed. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead. His hands shook. He'd survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. He'd survived the dogfight with American fighters. He'd survived the emergency landing. But now he was down on enemy territory, with no way to contact his superiors, no way to get home, and no idea what kind of reception he'd receive from whoever lived on this supposedly uninhabited island. He looked up and saw a Hawaiian man climbing onto his wing. Hawila Kaleohano moved quickly. He recognized the plane as Japanese from the red rising sun, painted on the fuselage and wings. He didn't know about Pearl Harbor, but he knew enough to disarm the pilot before the man could fully recover his senses. The pistol came out of the holster easily. Kaleohano tucked it into his waistband. Then he grabbed the leather folder containing the pilot's documents, maps, charts, what looked like military orders, and operational plans. The pilot was starting to wake up, his eyes focusing. Kaleohano backed away with the pistol and papers. Other islanders arrived. They helped the pilot out of the cockpit. He was unsteady, bleeding from the head wound, clearly shaken. Someone brought water. The pilot drank gratefully. He tried to speak, but his English was minimal. The Hawaiian spoke to him in Hawaiian, which he didn't understand at all. Despite the obvious complications, the Hawaiians treated Nishikaichi with the traditional Hawaiian hospitality extended to unexpected guests. They offered him food. They helped him to a shaded area to rest. Children gathered to stare at the crashed plane. Adults examined the Zero with curiosity and concern. Someone suggested bringing Yoshio Harada to translate. Harada and his wife Irene lived about a mile from where the plane had crashed. They spoke Japanese fluently. Harada arrived within the hour. He spoke to Nishikaichi in Japanese. The pilot explained that he'd been on a training flight when his engine failed. He needed to get in touch with Japanese authorities to arrange for rescue and to have his aircraft recovered. He was polite, even friendly. He thanked the Hawaiians for their assistance. Harada translated this to the Hawaiians. Most accepted the story. A few, including Kaleohano, remained suspicious. Training flight or not, the timing seemed strange, and Kaleohano had seen enough newspapers to know that Japanese training flights didn't usually happen this far from Japan. Nishikaichi asked for his pistol and papers back. Harada relayed the request. Kaleohano refused. He'd hold on to them until the island's owner, Aylmer Robinson, arrived. Robinson would know what to do with a downed Japanese pilot. Nishikaichi didn't press the issue. He was in no position to make demands. The Hawaiians outnumbered him 100 to 1. His plane was wrecked. He had no radio, no weapons, no way off the island. He'd have to wait for Robinson and hope the Americans would treat him well. That evening, following island tradition, the Niihauans threw a luau for their unexpected guest. They roasted a pig. They prepared poi and fish. Someone brought a guitar. Nishikaichi, who apparently played a little, sang Japanese songs. The Hawaiians sang their own songs in return. It was a friendly gathering, almost festive. The pilot seemed relaxed. The tension of the afternoon faded. But at some point during the evening, someone turned on a battery-powered radio. The broadcast from Honolulu came through crackling with static but clear enough to understand. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of Americans were dead. Battleships had been sunk. The nation was at war. The party stopped. Everyone looked at the Japanese pilot sitting with a guitar in his lap, still smiling, not understanding what had just been said in English. Harada translated the news to Nishikaichi. The pilot's expression didn't change much, but something shifted in his eyes. He set down the guitar. He asked Harada what would happen now. The Hawaiians gathered to discuss the situation. They'd been hosting an enemy pilot. The man sitting in their midst had probably participated in the attack that morning. He might have killed Americans. He was now a prisoner of war, except nobody on Niihau had any experience with prisoners of war or any authority to hold one. They decided to wait for Aylmer Robinson. He made weekly visits to the island, always on Mondays. Tomorrow was Monday. Robinson would arrive in the morning, and he'd know what to do. In the meantime, they'd keep Nishikaichi under house arrest. The Haradas offered to let him stay in their home. The Hawaiians agreed, but they posted guards outside to make sure the pilot didn't try to escape. Nishikaichi went to the Haradas' house. The guards settled in for the night. The island went quiet, but Robinson didn't arrive Monday morning. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States military had imposed total restrictions on all boat traffic around the Hawaiian Islands. No one could leave Kauai. No one could reach Niihau. Robinson was stuck, unable to make his weekly visit, unable to communicate with the island, unable to tell them what was happening. The Niihau's waited. Monday passed. Tuesday arrived. Still no Robinson. Nishikaichi remained under house arrest at the Harada's home. The guards watched. Nothing happened. On Tuesday night, December 9, Nishikaichi told the Haradas the truth. He'd participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. His aircraft had been damaged during the battle. He needed to destroy his plane and his documents so they wouldn't fall into American hands. The documents contained sensitive information, maps showing the attack routes, radio codes, operational plans for the Pearl Harbor strike. If the Americans got hold of them, it could compromise future operations. Nishikaichi asked the Haradas for help. He appealed to their Japanese heritage, to their sense of duty, to whatever loyalty they might feel toward the homeland of their ancestors. Japan was at war. He was a Japanese serviceman trapped behind enemy lines. Would they help him complete his mission? Yoshio Harada faced an impossible choice. He was an American citizen, born in Hawaii, loyal to the United States, but he was also of Japanese descent, living among people who might now see him as the enemy. The pilot was asking for help, and refusing might have consequences. What if Japan won the war? What if Japanese forces invaded Hawaii? How would Harada explain that he'd refused to help one of their pilots? On Wednesday night, December 10, Yoshio Harada made his decision. He would help Nishikaichi. Irene Harada agreed, though later she would claim she only wanted to help the pilot because she felt sorry for him, not because she supported Japan's war effort. At approximately 0200 hours on Thursday morning, December 11, Harada and Nishikaichi overpowered one of the guards outside the Haradas' house. They stole a shotgun and ammunition from a nearby warehouse. Then they headed for the crashed Zero. The battle for Niihau had begun. The guard they'd overpowered was a Hawaiian man who'd been dozing outside the Haradas' house. Harada hit him from behind. Nishikaichi grabbed his arms. They tied him up and left him in the house. Then they moved quickly to the warehouse where Robinson stored supplies and equipment. Breaking into the warehouse was easy. Inside, they found a 12-gauge shotgun and boxes of shells. They also found tools. Harada grabbed a wrench and a pair of pliers. They'd need those for the Zero. The crashed fighter sat in Kaleohano's field, where it had been for 4 days. The Hawaiians had left it alone, waiting for military authorities to arrive and inspect it. Now Harada and Nishikaichi approached it in the darkness. carrying the shotgun and tools. Nishikaichi climbed into the cockpit and tried the radio. Dead. Either the crash had destroyed it or the batteries had died. He couldn't contact the submarine that was supposed to be waiting offshore. He had no way to call for help. Harada suggested they salvage the plane's machine guns. The Zero carried two 7.7mm machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. If they could remove at least one gun with ammunition, they'd have real firepower. They worked for over an hour, using the wrench and pliers to unbolt one of the machine guns from its mount. They found several hundred rounds of ammunition in the feed system. Not much, but enough to be dangerous. Then they set the plane on fire. Nishikaichi soaked the cockpit with fuel from one of the auxiliary tanks that hadn't been punctured. He lit it with matches Harada had brought. The Zero burned quickly, the dry wood and fabric components catching easily. Within minutes, the entire aircraft was engulfed. The fire lit up the field like a beacon. Hawaiians woke to the sight of flames. They ran toward Kaleohano's field. By the time they arrived, Nishikaichi and Harada were gone, and the Zero was a smoking wreck. Kaleohano still had the pilot's documents hidden in his house. Nishikaichi knew that. The pilot's orders were to destroy those documents at all costs. He and Harada headed for Kaleohano's house. They reached it around 0400 hours. Kaleohano was asleep inside. Nishikaichi and Harada set the house on fire. Kaleohano woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of flames crackling through the walls. He grabbed the leather folder containing Nishikaichi's documents and ran for the back door. He burst outside just as the front of the house collapsed. Harada and Nishikaichi saw him and opened fire with the shotgun. Pellets tore through the air. Kaleohano dove into the brush and kept running. He made it to the village and started shouting warnings. The Japanese pilot had escaped. He had weapons. He'd burned Kaleohano's house. Everyone needed to evacuate immediately. Most of the villagers were skeptical. They'd just been woken up in the middle of the night by a man yelling about the Japanese pilot. Many thought Kaleohano was exaggerating or confused. But then the guard who'd been tied up at the Harada's house arrived, confirming the story. The pilot had overpowered him. Harada was helping the pilot. They had guns. The Hawaiians scattered. Some fled to caves in the hills. Others hid in thickets or ran to distant beaches. Parents carried children. The elderly moved as fast as they could. Within an hour, the central village was nearly deserted. Kaleohano made a different decision. He gathered 5 other men, the strongest rowers on the island. They launched a small boat and started the long journey to Kauai. It was 16 miles across open ocean. The men would have to row the entire way. It would take at least 10 hours. But Kaleohano still had Nishikaichi's documents, and he needed to get them to the authorities. He also needed to bring help. The 6 men rowed into the darkness, leaving Niihau behind. On Kauai, Aylmer Robinson had been watching Niihau anxiously for 3 days. He couldn't reach the island because of the military restrictions on boat traffic. He'd petitioned the authorities for permission to make his weekly visit, but they'd refused. Too dangerous. Japanese submarines might be lurking offshore. No civilian boats allowed. On Thursday night, December 11, Robinson saw something strange. Lights flashing from Niihau, kerosene lanterns, and reflectors, signaling toward Kauai. The Hawaiians were trying to communicate. Something was wrong. Robinson went to the military authorities immediately. He explained about the signals. He told them about the island's isolation, the lack of communication, the fact that Niihau had no defenses and no way to handle an emergency. The authorities listened, but still refused to let him cross. They promised to investigate, but not until they could arrange for military personnel to accompany him. That would take time. Robinson went home frustrated, staring across the channel at the dark shape of Niihau, wondering what was happening on his island. Nishikaichi and Harada spent Thursday searching for Kaleohano. They needed those documents. Without them, the Americans would learn details about the Pearl Harbor attack that could help them defend against future operations. Radio codes, flight paths, target priorities, all of it written down in the leather folder Kaleohano had taken. But Kaleohano was gone. The village was nearly empty. The few Hawaiians they encountered ran away before they could be caught. Nishikaichi and Harada searched houses, finding them abandoned. They found food and took it. They found more ammunition and loaded it into the shotgun and the machine gun they'd salvaged from the Zero. By Friday morning, December 12th, they'd captured 3 Hawaiians who'd been too slow to escape. They used these prisoners to carry the machine gun back to the village. The weapon was heavy and awkward. 2 men were needed to move it effectively. They set up a position in the center of the village, with the machine gun mounted on a makeshift tripod. Harada and Nishikaichi fired occasional bursts into the air, asserting control. The message was clear: anyone who resisted would be shot. That evening, they released one of their prisoners, a man named Hawila Kaleohano, called Kalima by everyone on the island. They ordered Kalima to find Kaleohano and bring him back, along with the documents. Kalima agreed and disappeared into the darkness. But Kalima had no intention of obeying. Instead, he found his friend Ben Kanahele and enlisted his help. The 2 men crept back toward the village under cover of darkness. Their plan was to steal the machine gun and ammunition, while Harada and Nishikaichi were distracted. The plan almost worked. Kalama and Kanahele got close enough to the machine gun position to see where it was set up, but they couldn't reach it without being spotted. They retreated into the darkness. Saturday morning, December 13, arrived. Kaleohano had been gone for over 24 hours. Harada and Nishikaichi realized he must have left the island. The documents were gone. The mission to destroy them had failed. Nishikaichi was exhausted, frustrated, and growing desperate. He'd been on Niihau for 6 days. No rescue had come. The submarine either wasn't there or couldn't find him. The island's population was terrified and hostile. His only ally was Harada, who seemed increasingly uncertain about what they were doing. Harada was having doubts. He'd helped Nishikaichi because he felt a confused sense of obligation to someone of Japanese descent, and perhaps because he feared what would happen if he refused. But now they'd burned houses, fired weapons, and terrorized the island. The Hawaiians he'd lived among for years were hiding from him. His wife Irene was frightened. This had gone too far. But Nishikaichi wouldn't stop. He ordered Harada to help him find more prisoners. They needed leverage. If they couldn't find Kaleohano, they'd force the other Hawaiians to help them get off the island. That morning, they captured Ben Kanahele and his wife Kealoha, who was known to everyone as Ella. Ben Kanahele was 51 years old, a large man who'd worked on sheep and cattle ranches his entire life. He was strong from years of physical labor, used to wrestling sheep and steers. He spoke only Hawaiian. His wife Ella was 44, small and quick, tougher than she looked. Harada and Nishikaichi ordered Ben to find Kaleohano. They kept Ella as a hostage to ensure Ben's cooperation. Ben knew perfectly well that Kaleohano had left the island, but he pretended to search. He walked through the village, calling Kaleohano's name, looking in empty houses. He was stalling, trying to figure out what to do. After about an hour, Ben became worried about Ella. He returned to where Harada and Nishikaichi were holding her. Nishikaichi realized immediately that Ben was deceiving them. Kaleohano wasn't on the island. The documents were gone. Harada translated Nishikaichi's anger. The pilot said he would kill Ben and everyone else in the village unless Kaleohano returned with the documents. Harada's voice shook as he translated. He didn't want to be part of this anymore, but he was trapped. He'd made his choice days ago, and now there was no way back. Ben looked at Nishikaichi and Harada. Both men were exhausted. They'd been awake for over 24 hours, running on adrenaline and fear. Nishikaichi's hands trembled slightly as he held the pistol. Harada held the shotgun, but he wasn't pointing it at anyone. He looked defeated. Ben saw an opportunity. He caught Ella's eye and nodded slightly. Nishikaichi was handing the shotgun to Harada. Momentarily distracted, Ben and Ella lunged simultaneously. Ben grabbed for the pilot. Ella went for the shotgun. Nishikaichi jerked backward and pulled his pistol from his boot where he'd been keeping it as a backup weapon. Ella grabbed his gun arm and forced it down. Harada pulled Ella off the pilot, but by then, Ben had his hands on Nishikaichi. The pilot fired 3 times at point-blank range. The first bullet hit Ben in the groin. The second struck his stomach. The third hit his upper leg. All 3 were serious wounds, any one of them potentially fatal. Ben Kanahele looked down at the blood spreading across his clothes. Later, He would tell people exactly what he thought at that moment. Then I got mad. He was a large man, over 200 pounds, enormously strong from decades of ranch work. Nishikaichi was small by comparison, maybe 130 pounds. Ben picked up the pilot the same way he picked up sheep on the ranch, grabbed him by the neck and one leg, lifted him completely off the ground, and hurled him into a stone wall. Nishikaichi's head struck the rock with a sickening crack. He collapsed. Ella grabbed a rock from the ground and smashed it into the pilot's skull. Ben pulled out his hunting knife and cut Nishikaichi's throat. The pilot died within seconds. Yoshio Harada watched his wife die in front of him. No, wait. I apologize for the error. Let me correct that. Yoshio Harada watched the pilot die. He stood there holding the shotgun, staring at Nishikaichi's body. Everything he'd done for the past 3 days, betraying his neighbors, helping an enemy combatant, terrorizing people he'd lived among peacefully, all of it had led to this moment. A man was dead. Ben Kanahele was bleeding from 3 gunshot wounds, and Harada knew there would be no forgiveness for what he'd done. He placed the shotgun barrel in his mouth and pulled the trigger. He died instantly. Hawila Kaleohano ran for help, leaving Ben sitting against the wall, bleeding from 3 serious gunshot wounds. She found other Hawaiians hiding in the hills and told them what had happened. They came back with makeshift stretchers and carried Ben to a sheltered location where they could try to stop the bleeding. Ben survived. The wounds were bad, but none had hit a major artery or vital organ. He was tough, and the island's women knew traditional Hawaiian medicine. They packed the wounds with herbs and cloth, applied pressure, and kept him immobilized. It would be another day before help arrived, and Ben could be taken to a proper hospital, but he made it through the night. On Sunday morning, December 14th, a military rescue party finally arrived on Niihau. Aylmer Robinson came with them, accompanied by 4 soldiers from Company M, 299th Infantry from Kauai, and a priest named Paul Larimore Denise. Hawila Kaleohano and the 5 men who'd rowed to Kauai came back as guides. They landed on the far side of the island from the village. The military authorities didn't know what situation they'd find. There might be multiple Japanese soldiers. There might be fighting. They proceeded cautiously, weapons ready. It took 6 hours to walk from their landing point to the village. About halfway there, they encountered Hawila Kanahele coming toward them. She was exhausted, covered in blood, some of it Ben's, some of it Nishikaichi's. She told them the battle was over. The pilot was dead. Yoshio Harada was dead. Ben was badly wounded but alive. When they reached the village, they found the Hawaiians emerging from their hiding places. The people were traumatized but unharmed, except for Ben. The soldiers examined the wreckage of the Zero, which was now just a blackened skeleton. They found Nishikaichi's body. They found Harada's body. They took Irene Harada and Ishimatsu Shintani into custody. Ben Kanahele was transported to Waimea Hospital on Kauai. His wounds were serious, but not life-threatening with proper medical care. He spent weeks recovering. The military investigated the incident thoroughly. They interviewed every resident of Niihau. They examined the physical evidence. They tried to understand how a single Japanese pilot had terrorized an entire island for 6 days with the help of just one man. Irene Harada was imprisoned on December 15, 1941, initially on Kauai, then transferred to a military prison on Oahu. She was held for 31 months, over 2.5 years. She was never charged with any crime. She was never put on trial. She was simply held as a potential security threat. During her imprisonment, interrogators questioned her repeatedly about her role in the incident. Irene maintained that she'd only wanted to help Nishikaichi because she felt sorry for him. She claimed she hadn't understood the full implications of what her husband was doing. She said she'd tried to discourage Yoshio from helping the pilot, but had been overruled. The interrogators didn't believe her, or if they did believe her, they didn't care. She was of Japanese descent. Her husband had helped an enemy combatant. That was enough. Irene was released in June 1944. She returned to Kauai, bitter and angry. She never returned to Niihau. She maintained her innocence for the rest of her life. In a 1992 interview with Japanese television, 51 years after the incident, she said she still felt sorry for Nishikaichi. He'd been young, trapped, desperate. She wished things had ended differently. Ishimatsu Shintani was sent to an internment camp on the mainland United States. His crime was being of Japanese descent and living on an island where a Japanese pilot had received help from people of Japanese ancestry. That was enough. He spent several years in the camps before being released. He eventually returned to Niihau, where he attained United States citizenship in 19. Ben Kanahele recovered from his wounds, though he carried scars for the rest of his life. On August 15, 1945, Victory over Japan Day, he was decorated at Army headquarters in Honolulu. Lieutenant General Robert Richardson presented him with the Medal for Merit, the highest civilian award the United States could give at that time. He also received the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. President Franklin Roosevelt personally commended Kanahele for his bravery. The official citation praised his courage in attacking an armed enemy despite being wounded 3 times. Composer R. Alex Anderson was so inspired by the incident that he wrote a song called "They Couldn't Take Niihau No-How." It became popular during the war years. Radio host Arthur Godfrey played it regularly on his nationally broadcast show, keeping the story alive in American popular culture. The ceremony in Honolulu was elaborate. Military dignitaries attended. Newspaper photographers documented it. Ben Kanahele, who spoke only Hawaiian and had never left the Hawaiian Islands before, stood uncomfortably in his formal clothes while generals pinned medals on his chest and journalists asked questions through translators. Ella Kanahele received no official recognition. She'd been just as brave as her husband. She jumped on an armed pilot, grabbed his gun arm, bashed his skull with a rock, but she was a woman, and in 1945, women didn't receive medals for combat actions. The military and the government simply ignored her contribution. Ben Kanahele died in 1962 at age 71. He returned to Niihau after the war and continued working as a ranch hand. He never sought publicity. He rarely spoke about the incident except when pressed. He'd done what needed to be done, and that was enough for him. Hawila Kaleohano, who'd had the presence of mind to disarm Nishikaichi immediately after the crash, and who'd rowed 16 miles across open ocean to bring help, received the Medal of Freedom. He too returned to Niihau and lived quietly. He died in 1986. The Niihau incident became national news within days. Newspapers across the United States ran stories about the Japanese pilot who terrorized a Hawaiian island and the Japanese Americans who'd helped him. The fact that Yoshio Harada was an American citizen born in Hawaii made the story even more troubling to military planners and government officials. On January 26, 1942, the United States Navy issued a report on the incident. The report noted that Ishimatsu Shintani and the Haradas, all Niihauans of Japanese ancestry who'd been considered loyal to the United States, had aided the enemy pilot. The report concluded that this demonstrated the likelihood that Japanese residents, previously believed loyal to the United States, may aid Japan if given the opportunity. Federal Bureau of Investigation Director J. Edgar Hoover authored a memorandum about the incident. He emphasized the actions of the 3 Japanese residents and their willingness to help an enemy combatant. The memorandum circulated through military and government channels in Washington. The Niihau incident didn't cause the Japanese-American internment by itself. The decision to remove over 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast and imprison them in inland camps resulted from many factors: wartime hysteria, racial prejudice, economic opportunism, and political pressure. But the Niihau incident provided what seemed like concrete evidence that Japanese Americans couldn't be trusted. Military officials and politicians pointed to Niihau when justifying internment. If second-generation American citizens like Yoshio Harada would help an enemy pilot, how could anyone trust other Japanese Americans? The fact that tens of thousands of Japanese Americans served loyally in the United States military, many with extraordinary heroism, was ignored. The actions of 2 people on a tiny Hawaiian island became the justification for imprisoning over 100,000 people, most of whom were American citizens. Historian Gordon Prange noted that it was the rapidity with which the 3 resident Japanese went over to the pilot's cause that troubled both Hawaiians and military authorities. More pessimistic observers cited the Niihau incident as proof that no Japanese could be trusted, regardless of citizenship or demonstrated loyalty. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, just 73 days after the Niihau incident, authorized the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Over the following months, families were given days or sometimes just hours to dispose of their property, pack what they could carry, and report to assembly centers. From there, they were transported to internment camps in remote areas: Manzanar in California, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz in Utah, Rollwer in Arkansas, and 6 other locations. They lost homes, businesses, farms, savings. They lost years of their lives. Families were separated. Children grew up behind barbed wire. Young men were forced to choose between serving in the military, while their families remained imprisoned or refusing to serve and being branded as disloyal. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion, composed almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, became the most decorated units in United States military history. They fought with extraordinary courage in Italy and France, while their families remained in camps. They earned over 18,000 individual decorations, including 9 FAR 486 Purple Hearts and 21 Medals of Honor. Their motto was, "Go for broke." They were proving their loyalty, while the Niihau incident was still being cited as evidence that Japanese Americans couldn't be trusted. The pilot's hometown. In Hashihama, Japan, Shigenori Nishikaichi's hometown, a monument was erected in his honor. The town erected it in 1942, when they still believed Nishikaichi had died on December 7, crashing his plane into some worthy target after the Pearl Harbor attack. They thought he died a hero's death. The monument stands 12 feet tall, made of granite. Engraved on it are words commemorating what they believed at the time. Having expended every effort, he achieved the greatest honor of all by dying a soldier's death in battle, destroying both himself and his beloved plane. His meritorious deed will live forever. For many years, Nishikaichi's remains were unidentified. The United States military had buried him as an unknown Japanese soldier. It wasn't until 1956, 15 years after his death, that the circumstances became known to his family. They claimed his ashes and learned the truth. Their son hadn't died heroically in battle. He'd crash-landed on a small island, terrorized civilians for 6 days with the help of Japanese Americans, and been killed while holding a family hostage. The monument remained. The inscription was never changed. Nishikaichi is still honored in his hometown as a hero who died serving his country. In June 2017, Nishikaichi's nafuda was returned to his family. The nafuda was a set of 7 wooden sticks carried by Japanese pilots. The sticks bore the names of Nishikaichi's colleagues, the identifying markings of his Zero and his administrative command. How the nafuda survived and who held it for 76 years remains unclear, but the family received it and presumably added it to their shrine for their son. The Forbidden Island today, Niihau, remains privately owned by the Robinson family. It's still closed to outsiders except for rare authorized visits. The population has declined to around 70 permanent residents, all of them native Hawaiians. There's still no electricity grid, no paved roads, no regular transportation to other islands. The primary language is still Hawaiian. The wreckage of Nishikaichi Zero was picked over by souvenir hunters for years after the war. Pieces disappeared. What remains is now displayed at the Pacific Aviation Museum at Pearl Harbor on Ford Island. The museum also displays the old tractor that islanders used to try to move the plane before it was burned. The incident remains a sensitive subject. The role of the Haradas and Shintani continues to generate debate. Were they traitors who helped an enemy combatant out of misguided loyalty to Japan? Or were they frightened people caught in an impossible situation, trying to navigate divided loyalties in a way that made sense to them at the time? Irene Harada maintained until her death that she'd only wanted to help a young man who was trapped and desperate. Yoshio Harada never had a chance to explain his actions. He died on that Saturday morning in December, and whatever motivated him died with him. The Hawaiians of Niihau rarely speak about the incident. It's part of their history, but not a part they celebrate. They remember Ben and Ella Kanahele as heroes. They remember the terror of those 6 days, but they prefer to let the past remain in the past. December 7th, 1941. Changed the world. Bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the Second World War, and on a tiny island that most Americans had never heard of, a Japanese pilot crash-landed and set in motion 6 days that would influence the fate of over 100,000 Japanese Americans. The Niihau Incident proved that war doesn't respect isolation. It demonstrated that divided loyalties create impossible choices, and it showed that ordinary people, Hawaiian ranchers who spoke only Hawaiian and had never left their island, could show extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. Ben Kanahele was shot 3 times and still overpowered an armed man. Hawila Kanahele attacked without hesitation, despite being unarmed and half the pilot's size. Hawila Kaleohano rowed 16 miles across open ocean to bring help. They were heroes by any measure, but their heroism became tangled up in a larger story about fear, prejudice, and wartime hysteria. The actions of 2 people on Niihau became justification for imprisoning over 100,000 people who'd done nothing wrong. That's the bitter legacy of the Forbidden Island's 6-day siege. If you found this story of courage, divided loyalty, and consequences compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to WWII Tales to stay connected with history that matters. The forgotten battles, the moral complexities, and the human costs of war. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what aspect of the Niihau incident struck you most powerfully. Thank you for watching and for remembering.